Girls don't fight, they cry and run away, sneered Dakota Williams, the 6-foot-tall captain of Ridgemont University's wrestling team, his voice echoing across the packed gymnasium at the annual Warriors Challenge tournament. The crowd of over 300 spectators erupted in mocking laughter, their voices bouncing off the concrete walls of the massive sports complex. Behind him, his 4 teammates flexed their muscles, each one weighing over 200 pounds of pure intimidation. They had just finished demolishing their opponents in the intercollegiate combat sports exhibition, and now they were looking for easy entertainment. Standing perfectly still in the center of the blue wrestling mat, 23-year-old Aria Blackstone appeared almost fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, wearing simple black athletic wear, she looked like a lost college student who had wandered into the wrong event. Her long auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her green eyes remained strangely calm despite being surrounded by 5 of the most aggressive athletes on campus. The audience continued their cruel laughter, many pulling out their phones to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing spectacle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Look at this little princess, Dakota continued, stepping closer with predatory confidence. She thinks she can handle real fighters. Sweetheart, why don't you go back to your sorority house and paint your nails? His teammates roared with approval, and several fraternity members in the crowd began chanting mockingly. The tournament organizers had reluctantly allowed Aria to participate after she'd signed multiple liability waivers, but everyone assumed it was just a publicity stunt or a dare gone wrong. What none of them knew was that Aria had been watching, listening, and calculating for the past 15 minutes. She had observed Dakota's aggressive left hook tendency, noticed how his teammates favored their right legs for kicks, and identified the exactly 17-second window between their boastful speeches when their guards dropped completely. Her breathing remained controlled, her stance deceptively relaxed, and her hands hung loosely at her sides in a position that looked submissive but was actually a perfect combat-ready stance. The gymnasium's atmosphere was electric with cruel anticipation. Students filled every bleacher, their voices creating a deafening wall of sound that mixed laughter, jeers, and excited chatter. Local news cameras had been called to cover the tournament, and now they focused their lenses on what appeared to be the most lopsided matchup in college sports history. Dakota's girlfriend, sitting in the front row wearing his wrestling team jacket, was live-streaming the event on social media with the caption, "Watch this girl get destroyed LOL. I'll tell you what," Dakota announced, spreading his arms wide in a theatrical gesture that made the crowd roar louder. "Since you're clearly not equipped for a real fight, how about we make this interesting? You land one solid hit on any of us, and we'll donate $1,000 to whatever women's charity you want." His teammates laughed and nodded, completely confident in their physical superiority. But when you embarrass yourself in front of everyone here, you publicly admit that girls have no business in combat sports and apologize for wasting our time. The crowd loved this proposal, cheering and whistling their approval. Someone in the back shouted, "Make it 10,000," while others began placing informal bets on how quickly the fight would be over. Most were predicting less than 30 seconds before Aria would either run away crying or get knocked down and give up. The energy in the room was intoxicating for everyone except the quiet young woman standing in the center of it all. Aria finally spoke for the first time since entering the gymnasium, her voice cutting through the noise with unexpected clarity and composure. $1,000 to the Ridgemont Women's Crisis Center, she said simply, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I want to modify your terms slightly." Dakota grinned, thinking she was about to back down or negotiate for easier conditions. "When I win, you and your entire team publicly apologize not just to me, but to every woman you've ever harassed or intimidated on this campus." The laughter reached a crescendo. Dakota's face turned red with amusement, and he actually had to wipe tears from his eyes. "Oh, this is rich. When you win. Honey, you couldn't win against my little sister, and she's in middle school." The crowd was eating up every word, their phones now recording from every angle. Social media notifications were already pinging as clips of the delusional girl began spreading across campus networks. What happened next would be replayed on news stations, analyzed by combat sports experts, and discussed in gender studies classes for years to come. In exactly 10 minutes and 37 seconds, every single person in that gymnasium would witness something that shattered their assumptions about strength, training, and what happens when entitled bullies encounter someone who had been forged in fires they couldn't even imagine. But in that moment, as Dakota stepped forward with his fists raised and his teammates spread out to surround their helpless victim, none of them noticed the small scar above Aria's left eyebrow. None of them saw the calluses on her knuckles that came from years of striking surfaces much harder than human bone. And absolutely none of them recognized the stance of someone who had spent the last 8 years training in underground fight clubs across 3 continents, learning techniques that weren't taught in any college wrestling program. The referee, a nervous graduate student who had volunteered for what he thought would be easy extra credit, looked uncertainly between the massive male athletes and the small woman who seemed remarkably unintimidated by her circumstances. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked Aria quietly. "There's no shame in walking away." Aria's response was barely audible, but the microphones picked it up anyway. "Walking away isn't an option anymore." Dakota cracked his knuckles theatrically and grinned at his teammates. "All right, boys. Let's teach this little princess what real fighting looks like. Try not to hurt her too badly. We don't want a lawsuit." The crowd counted down from 10, their voices united in anticipation of what they believed would be swift and humiliating entertainment. As they reached 0 and the referee reluctantly signaled the start, Dakota lunged forward with all the confidence of someone who had never faced a real predator disguised as prey. 10 minutes and 37 seconds later, paramedics would be rushing into that gymnasium, but not for the person everyone expected. Aria Blackstone had arrived at Ridgemont University just 3 weeks earlier as a transfer student from what her transcripts listed as International Studies Program, various locations. To her new dorm mates in Willowbrook Hall, she seemed like the perfect target for their gossip sessions. Petite, soft-spoken, and carrying herself with an almost apologetic posture, she appeared to be everything they expected from someone who spent her free time in the library rather than at campus parties. Her roommate, Jessica Harper, a bubbly communications major from suburban Connecticut, had immediately taken it upon herself to help the shy new girl adjust to college life. Jessica would later tell reporters that Aria seemed almost fragile, like someone who had never raised her voice in her entire life, let alone her fists. "She was so polite, always saying please and thank you," Jessica recalled. She'd apologize for using the microwave too late at night or for her alarm going off in the morning. "I honestly thought she might have some kind of anxiety disorder." The official story was simple. Aria Blackstone, 23 years old, originally from Portland, Oregon, had spent the previous 5 years traveling with her anthropologist father, studying indigenous cultures across remote regions of the world. She was finally settling down to complete her degree in international relations, focusing on conflict resolution and peace studies. Her academic records showed excellent grades but gaps in traditional schooling, explained by her unconventional educational journey through homeschooling and independent study programs. What her transcripts didn't mention was that those anthropological expeditions had taken her to places where survival wasn't academic theory but daily necessity. Her classmates saw a quiet girl who carried her books in a worn leather satchel and preferred herbal tea over coffee. They didn't see someone who could identify 17 different pressure points on the human body or distinguish between the sound of a real threat and empty posturing from across a crowded room. During her first week at Ridgemont, Aria had observed the complex social hierarchies that governed campus life with the same analytical precision she'd once used to study territorial disputes in war-torn regions. She noticed how certain groups claimed dominance through intimidation, how power was maintained through fear rather than respect, and how the most vulnerable students learned to make themselves invisible to survive. Her dorm mates found her quirks endearing but odd. She never seemed to sleep past dawn, often returning from early morning jogs that lasted for hours. When questioned, she'd smile shyly and explain that she had trouble adjusting to sleeping indoors after so many years camping under stars. Her roommate Jessica often wondered why someone who claimed to love nature had such an extensive collection of what looked like homemade first aid supplies, or why Aria's running shoes looked like they'd been through combat zones rather than campus pathways. The other students in her international relations classes initially dismissed her as another privileged girl who had traveled the world with daddy's money. Professor Mitchell Henderson, who taught advanced conflict analysis, later admitted he had categorized her as a typical trust fund student looking for easy credits. Her early papers were well-researched but written with an unusual perspective. She wrote about genocide, civil wars, and refugee crises with a clinical precision that seemed too detached for someone who had supposedly only studied these topics academically. She had this way of describing violence, Professor Henderson recalled months later. It wasn't theoretical or academic. She wrote about conflict zones like someone who had smelled the smoke and heard the screams. But she was so quiet in class, always sitting in the back, never challenging anyone's opinions. I assumed she was just a good researcher who used primary sources effectively. What none of them realized was that Aria had indeed smelled the smoke and heard the screams. Her anthropological expeditions had been covers for something much more dangerous and necessary. While her classmates had spent their teenage years worrying about prom dates and college applications, Aria had been learning to navigate situations where the wrong decision meant the difference between life and death. Her physical appearance perfectly supported her cover story. She dressed in comfortable, unremarkable clothing, usually jeans, simple sweaters, and worn sneakers that looked like standard college fare. Her auburn hair was almost always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup, if any. To casual observers, she looked like someone who had spent more time reading books than developing physical capabilities. The few times she had been forced to interact in potentially confrontational situations, Aria had perfected the art of appearing even smaller and more helpless than she actually was. When a drunk fraternity brother had cornered her after a campus mixer, she had responded with such convincing timidity that he had actually backed off, laughing about how pathetic she was to his friends. When a group of sorority sisters had mocked her thrift store clothes, she had simply looked down at her feet and walked away, reinforcing their assumption that she was too weak to defend herself. But those who looked more carefully might have noticed subtle inconsistencies in her carefully constructed persona. Her reflexes were too quick for someone who claimed to be naturally clumsy. Her awareness of her surroundings was too sharp for someone who seemed perpetually lost in thought. And despite her apparent shyness, she never seemed genuinely afraid of anything or anyone, an unusual trait for someone who was supposedly intimidated by college social hierarchies. Jessica had once asked about the small scar above Aria's left eyebrow, which she claimed came from falling out of a tree while birdwatching in Costa Rica. She had also questioned the unusual calluses on Aria's palms, which Aria attributed to extensive rock climbing during her travels. Every story was plausible, delivered with convincing embarrassment and backed up with carefully prepared details that discouraged further questioning. The truth was that Aria Blackstone was perhaps the most dangerous person on Ridgemont University's campus, but she had spent years perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. She had learned that the best camouflage wasn't physical concealment but psychological misdirection. Let people see what they expected to see, and they would never look deeper. Her professors saw a sheltered rich girl trying to understand the world through textbooks. Her classmates saw an awkward introvert who would probably drop out before the semester ended. Her dorm mates saw someone who needed protection and guidance to survive college life. None of them saw someone who had survived situations that would have broken most trained soldiers, someone who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, someone who had walked away from a life of constant danger seeking nothing more than the peace of anonymity and the simple pleasure of attending lectures about conflicts she had lived through rather than causing. But peace, Aria was beginning to understand, was something that had to be fought for and defended. And sometimes the greatest threat to peace came from those who mistook kindness for weakness and saw vulnerability where there was actually carefully controlled power waiting for the right moment to emerge. 3 weeks into her new life at Ridgemont University, that moment was rapidly approaching. The culture at Ridgemont University had been rotting from within for nearly a decade, though most students had learned to accept the toxic atmosphere as simply how things worked in higher education. At the center of this systematic dysfunction was the athletic department, specifically the wrestling and combat sports programs that had evolved into something far more sinister than competitive college athletics. Dakota Williams hadn't built this culture of intimidation alone, but he had certainly perfected it during his 4 years as team captain. The wrestling team's dominance extended far beyond their official matches and tournaments. They had established themselves as the unofficial enforcers of campus hierarchy, determining who belonged where in the complex social ecosystem that governed student life. Their methods were brutal, systematic, and had been refined through years of getting away with behavior that would have resulted in criminal charges in any other environment. The pattern always followed the same predictable script. New students, particularly those who seemed vulnerable or different, would be identified as targets during orientation week. The wrestlers would then begin a campaign of escalating harassment that started with harmless pranks and verbal abuse, but could quickly escalate to physical intimidation and outright assault. The administration had learned to look the other way, partly because the wrestling team brought significant revenue and prestige to the university, and partly because Dakota's father was a major donor who had funded the construction of the new athletic complex. Female students bore the worst of their aggression. The wrestlers had developed an elaborate system for rating and categorizing women on campus, determining who was worth their attention and who deserved to be made an example of. They particularly targeted women who showed any sign of independence, intelligence, or refusal to conform to their expectations of submissive femininity. Academic achievers, student activists, and anyone who dared to challenge their behavior would find themselves subjected to relentless persecution that could last for months. Sarah Martinez, a senior psychology major, had experienced their systematic harassment firsthand during her sophomore year after she had filed a complaint about inappropriate behavior at a campus party. Within days, her dorm room had been vandalized, her academic papers had been stolen from the library, and she had received anonymous threatening messages that made her afraid to walk alone anywhere on campus. When she tried to report the escalation to campus security, she was told there was insufficient evidence to pursue the matter, despite the fact that everyone knew exactly who was responsible. The wrestlers' influence extended throughout the entire athletic department and into the broader university administration. Coaches in other sports had learned to keep their athletes in line to avoid conflicts with the wrestling team. Academic departments discovered that certain students were untouchable, regardless of their behavior or academic performance. Even campus security officers had been warned that aggressive intervention against popular athletes could result in budget cuts and job losses. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a professor in the Gender Studies department, had been documenting the systematic abuse for over 3 years. Her confidential files contained dozens of testimonies from students who had suffered everything from verbal harassment to sexual assault, but who were too afraid to come forward officially. The pattern was always the same. Victims would be isolated from their support networks, subjected to escalating intimidation, and ultimately forced to either transfer to other schools or simply endure the abuse in silence. They operate like a military unit, Dr. Reynolds had written in her private notes. There's a clear command structure, coordinated tactics, and a complete understanding that they face no real consequences for their actions. They've created a reign of terror that extends far beyond their immediate victims. Students modify their behavior, their class schedules, even their career choices to avoid attracting their attention. The wrestling team's home base was the Titan Athletic Complex, a state-of-the-art facility that had become their fortress and headquarters. The building's main gymnasium was where they held their informal challenges and demonstrations of dominance. Students would be lured or forced into confrontations that were designed to humiliate and break their spirit while providing entertainment for the wrestlers and their supporters. These events had become twisted spectacles that drew crowds of students who had been conditioned to view the systematic humiliation of their peers as acceptable entertainment. The wrestlers had created an atmosphere where violence was normalized, where might made right, and where anyone who couldn't defend themselves physically was considered fair game for any form of abuse. Marcus Thompson, who had graduated the previous year, later described the culture to investigators. It wasn't just about winning fights or being strong. They got off on the psychological destruction. They would study their targets, learn their vulnerabilities, and then design specific forms of torment that would cause maximum emotional damage. The physical stuff was almost secondary to the mind games. The administration's complicity in maintaining this toxic environment went far beyond simple negligence. Dean of Students Robert Fitzgerald had personally intervened multiple times to prevent serious investigations into the wrestlers' behavior. When local police had attempted to follow up on assault complaints, they had been told that the incidents were internal university matters that would be handled through student conduct processes that inevitably resulted in minimal consequences. The wrestlers had also cultivated relationships with influential alumni and community members who viewed their aggressive behavior as evidence of strong character and leadership potential. Corporate recruiters specifically sought out members of the wrestling team, believing that their willingness to dominate others translated into valuable business skills. This external validation reinforced their sense of invincibility and entitlement. Female students had developed elaborate systems for avoiding contact with the wrestling team. They would share information about the wrestlers' schedules, warn each other about dangerous locations and times, and travel in groups whenever possible. Many had learned to dress down, avoid eye contact, and make themselves as invisible as possible when in proximity to team members. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Students throughout the university lived in a constant state of low-level anxiety, never knowing when they might inadvertently attract the wrong kind of attention. Academic performance suffered as students spent mental energy on survival strategies rather than learning. Career ambitions were modified to avoid fields or activities that might bring them into conflict with the wrestling team or their supporters. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a counselor at the university's mental health center, had seen a dramatic increase in students seeking help for anxiety, depression, and trauma-related symptoms. Many couldn't or wouldn't explain the specific source of their distress, but the patterns were unmistakable. Students were arriving at college and quickly learning that their physical and emotional safety depended on their willingness to submit to an unofficial hierarchy maintained through the threat of violence. The wrestlers had also perfected techniques for avoiding official accountability. They were careful to ensure that their most serious abuses occurred in locations without security cameras, during times when witnesses could be controlled or intimidated. They maintained detailed intelligence about university policies and procedures, always staying just within the boundaries of what they could explain away as boys being boys or competitive athletic culture. By the time Aria Blackstone arrived at Ridgemont University, this system of institutionalized intimidation had become so normalized that most students couldn't imagine the campus functioning any other way. New arrivals were quickly educated about the unwritten rules. Don't challenge the wrestlers, don't attract their attention, and definitely don't give them any reason to view you as a threat to their dominance. The Warriors Challenge Tournament had become the wrestlers' annual showcase, their opportunity to demonstrate their power in front of the largest possible audience while maintaining the thin veneer of legitimate athletic competition. It was here that they would select their most public victims, ensuring that their dominance was witnessed and acknowledged by the entire campus community. What none of them realized was that this year's tournament would become the beginning of the end for their reign of terror. The small, quiet transfer student who had signed up for the open challenge wasn't just another victim walking into their trap. She was something they had never encountered before. Someone who had survived far worse than anything they could imagine. Someone who had been forged in fires that would have reduced them to ashes. And someone who had finally decided that some things were worth fighting for. The toxic culture that Dakota Williams and his team had spent years building was about to meet an unstoppable force that looked like their most helpless victim. During her first 3 weeks at Ridgemont University, Aria had developed a carefully structured routine that allowed her to observe the campus ecosystem while maintaining her cover as a harmless transfer student. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., she would slip out of Willowbrook Hall for what she told her roommate Jessica were therapeutic nature walks, to help with her adjustment anxiety. In reality, these 2-hour excursions were comprehensive reconnaissance missions that mapped every corner of the university's social and physical landscape. Her route took her through the athletic complex during early morning training sessions, past fraternity houses where she could observe the hierarchy dynamics between different Greek organizations, and around the academic buildings where she noted which professors arrived early and which students seemed isolated or distressed. She carried a small notebook disguised as a journal for poetry, but her entries were actually detailed behavioral observations written in a personal shorthand she had developed years earlier. What she discovered was a university where fear operated like an invisible currency. Students had learned to navigate their daily lives around the wrestlers' schedules and territories. The library's third floor, which offered the best study spaces, was practically abandoned between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. when the wrestling team typically used the adjacent computer lab. The campus coffee shop saw a noticeable drop in female customers during certain hours, and entire sections of the student union building were treated as no-go zones by anyone who wanted to avoid confrontation. Aria began inserting herself into situations where she could quietly demonstrate competence while reinforcing her harmless persona. When she witnessed a freshman named David Chun being cornered by two wrestlers outside the engineering building, she had approached with a stack of heavy textbooks and accidentally dropped them, creating enough distraction for the young man to escape while she apologized profusely for her clumsiness. The wrestlers had barely acknowledged her presence, dismissing her as too pathetic to bother with. Dr. Patricia Reynolds first noticed Aria during a gender studies lecture on institutional power structures. While other students took conventional notes, Aria was sketching what appeared to be organizational charts that mapped relationships between different campus groups with an accuracy that suggested either exceptional analytical skills or direct experience with similar systems. When Dr. Reynolds called on her to contribute to a discussion about resistance movements, Aria's response was so precisely articulated and strategically sophisticated that several graduate students turned to stare at her in surprise. She had this way of discussing oppression and resistance that was completely different from other students, Dr. Reynolds later recalled. Most of them approached these topics academically, citing theorists and historical examples. But Aria spoke about power dynamics like someone who had lived them, who understood them from the inside. Her insights were uncomfortably accurate and disturbingly practical. The turning point came during a seemingly insignificant incident in the university dining hall. Aria was sitting alone with a book when she noticed a sophomore named Kelly Brooks being systematically harassed by Dakota Williams and two of his teammates. They had surrounded her table, making increasingly explicit comments about her appearance, while she tried to ignore them and continue eating. Other students in the dining hall had noticed but were pretending not to see, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. Aria closed her book, approached the wrestlers' table, and began what appeared to be a nervous, stammering request for directions to the academic advisor's office. Her performance was perfect. She seemed so genuinely confused and helpless that the wrestlers became annoyed with her interruption rather than viewing her as a threat. While they were focused on dismissing her, Kelly was able to gather her belongings and leave through the back exit. The wrestlers never connected Aria's intervention with the victim's escape. But Kelly noticed. Later that evening, she found Aria in the library and quietly thanked her. This interaction led to others. Word spread through an underground network of students who had been victimized by the wrestling team that there was someone new on campus who might be willing to help. Someone who seemed to understand how to navigate dangerous situations without escalating them. Soon, Aria was receiving subtle requests for assistance. A text message asking if she knew anything about staying safe while walking alone at night. An email wondering if she had any advice for dealing with aggressive people. A note slipped under her dorm room door asking if she would be willing to accompany someone to file a complaint with campus security. Each request was carefully worded to maintain plausible deniability, but the message was clear. Students were reaching out to someone they sensed might have answers. Her responses were always practical and precise. She taught a group of female students basic situational awareness techniques, disguising the lessons as personal safety tips she had learned while traveling. She helped several victims document incidents with the thoroughness of someone who understood evidence collection and legal procedures. She provided emotional support that seemed to come from genuine understanding of trauma rather than textbook knowledge. Jessica began noticing changes in their dorm room that didn't match Aria's supposed background. The first aid supplies became more extensive and sophisticated. A set of what looked like professional-grade lockpicks appeared in Aria's desk drawer, which she explained as anthropological tools for studying different cultures' security methods. Her laptop displayed software programs that seemed far more advanced than anything required for international relations coursework. Most telling was Aria's physical conditioning, which became impossible to hide as the weeks progressed. Her therapeutic nature walks were clearly more intensive than casual exercise. Her reflexes were too sharp, her balance too perfect, her awareness of her surroundings too constant for someone who claimed to have spent years in academic environments. When she moved, it was with an economy of motion that suggested extensive training in efficiency and stealth. Professor Mitchell Henderson assigned a research paper on conflict resolution in post-war societies, expecting typical undergraduate work that would combine basic research with idealistic theories about peacebuilding. Aria's submission was a 40-page analysis that read like an operational manual for rebuilding social structures after the collapse of institutional authority. Her sources included obscure field reports, classified documents that shouldn't have been accessible to students, and personal interviews with individuals whose names appeared in no academic databases. It wasn't just the quality of her research, Professor Henderson explained months later. It was the perspective. She wrote about rebuilding trust in traumatized communities like someone who had done it multiple times. Her recommendations weren't theoretical. They were practical, tested strategies with specific timelines and measurable outcomes. I started wondering if she had been involved in actual reconstruction efforts rather than just studying them. The wrestling team remained oblivious to Aria's growing influence among their victims. They saw occasional glimpses of her around campus but dismissed her as another invisible, irrelevant female student who posed no threat to their dominance. Their attention was focused on identifying new targets and planning the annual Warriors Challenge tournament, where they could demonstrate their power in front of the largest possible audience. What they didn't realize was that their systematic persecution had created exactly the conditions Aria was most familiar with. An oppressed population desperate for liberation, an entrenched authority structure dependent on fear and intimidation, and a corrupt system that protected perpetrators while abandoning victims. She had encountered these dynamics in war zones and failed states around the world, and she understood that sustainable change required more than just removing individual bad actors. The network of students who had begun quietly seeking her help was growing larger and more coordinated. They were learning to document incidents, support each other, and recognize that their individual experiences were part of a larger pattern of systematic abuse. More importantly, they were beginning to believe that resistance was possible, that they didn't have to accept their victimization as inevitable. Aria's carefully maintained cover as a harmless, anxious transfer student remained intact, but beneath that surface, she was methodically preparing for something the wrestling team had never faced. Organized, strategic resistance from someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to demonstrate that their victims were no longer afraid. The Warriors Challenge tournament was rapidly approaching, and with it, the opportunity Aria had been waiting for. The wrestlers were about to discover that their latest target wasn't another helpless victim, but someone who had been analyzing their weaknesses, studying their tactics, and preparing to turn their own methods against them in ways they could never have anticipated. The crisis that would force Aria into direct action began 3 days before the Warriors Challenge tournament, triggered by an escalation that crossed every line the wrestling team had carefully maintained for years. It started with Maya Patel, a brilliant engineering student whose only mistake had been refusing Dakota Williams' advances at a campus mixer the previous weekend. Maya had politely but firmly declined his invitation to leave the party with him, a rejection that Dakota had taken as a public humiliation requiring swift and decisive retaliation. The harassment campaign against Maya began immediately and followed the wrestler's established pattern of systematic psychological warfare. Her dorm room was broken into and vandalized, with threatening messages scrawled on her walls and her academic materials destroyed. Anonymous social media accounts began spreading fabricated rumors about her personal life, accompanied by doctored photos that suggested compromising situations. Her car tires were slashed repeatedly, and she began receiving explicit threatening voicemails at all hours of the day and night. But Dakota's fury over the public rejection pushed him beyond the team's usual boundaries of calculated intimidation. On Tuesday evening, Maya was leaving her advanced robotics lab when she was surrounded by Dakota and 3 of his teammates in the isolated parking garage beneath the engineering building. What happened next would be captured by security cameras that the wrestlers hadn't known existed, hidden among the building's recently installed infrastructure upgrades. The footage showed Dakota grabbing Maya by the throat and slamming her against a concrete pillar while his teammates blocked the exits. For nearly 10 minutes, they subjected her to escalating physical and sexual assault that went far beyond their usual intimidation tactics. Maya's desperate attempts to escape were met with increasingly violent responses, and by the time they finally left her unconscious on the garage floor, she had sustained injuries that would require emergency medical treatment. Maya was discovered 2 hours later by a graduate student working late in the lab. She was rushed to Ridgemont General Hospital with a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and internal injuries that would keep her in intensive care for days. The security footage provided undeniable evidence of the attack, but the university's initial response followed their established pattern of protecting the wrestling team at all costs. Within hours of Maya's hospitalization, Dean Robert Fitzgerald had contacted her parents with a carefully prepared narrative that described the incident as an unfortunate altercation between students that escalated beyond normal campus conflicts. He suggested that pressing charges would be counterproductive for Maya's academic future, as it would create ongoing complications with prominent student athletes and their influential family connections. The implied threat was clear. Pursuing justice would result in Maya becoming a target for even more severe retaliation. The wrestlers themselves showed no concern about potential consequences. They had operated with impunity for so long that they genuinely believed their actions would be covered up and forgotten like countless previous incidents. Dakota was already planning his next moves, discussing with his teammates how they could use Maya's hospitalization as an example to other students who might consider defying their authority. But this time, their calculation was wrong. Maya Patel wasn't an isolated victim without support systems or documentation. She was part of the informal network that had been quietly building around Aria's carefully orchestrated resistance efforts. Within hours of the attack, detailed information about the assault was flowing through encrypted communication channels that connected dozens of previous victims and their allies. Dr. Patricia Reynolds received an anonymous message that contained not only the security footage of Maya's assault, but also a comprehensive file documenting 3 years of systematic abuse by the wrestling team. The evidence included witness testimonies, medical records, documented threats, and a detailed analysis of the university administration's pattern of cover-ups and victim intimidation. The package was professionally assembled and legally bulletproof, prepared by someone who clearly understood both investigative techniques and legal procedures. Aria learned about Maya's assault within 6 hours of its occurrence, through a text message from Kelly Brooks that simply said, "They went too far this time. Maya is in the hospital. We can't let this continue." The message included a hospital room number and visiting hours, but Aria understood that this wasn't just an invitation to offer support to an injured student. It was a call to action from a community that had reached its breaking point. When Aria arrived at Maya's hospital room the next morning, she found a young woman whose physical injuries were severe but whose spirit remained unbroken. Maya's eyes were swollen shut, her left arm was in a cast, and monitors tracked her vital signs while pain medications helped manage her internal injuries. But when she heard Aria's voice introducing herself, Maya's response was immediate and surprising. "You're the one who's been helping people," Maya whispered through damaged vocal cords. "Kelly told me about you, about what you've been doing." Despite her injuries, Maya's grip on Aria's hand was surprisingly strong. "They think this will scare everyone back into submission. They think breaking one of us will keep the rest in line." Maya's medical chart told a story that went beyond the immediate assault. Her injuries were consistent with systematic, prolonged violence rather than a single incident. The emergency room physician had noted defensive wounds and healed fractures that suggested previous unreported attacks. Maya had been living under siege for weeks, enduring escalating abuse while trying to maintain her academic performance and normal student life. "I documented everything," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength despite her obvious pain. "Every threat, every incident, every time they made me feel like I was going crazy for thinking this wasn't normal. I knew eventually they would push too far, and I wanted to be ready." She directed Aria to a hidden compartment in her backpack, which contained a flash drive with months of evidence collection. Maya had been recording conversations, photographing damage to her property, and maintaining detailed logs of harassment incidents with timestamps and witness information. Her engineering background had taught her the importance of systematic data collection, and she had applied those skills to building an ironclad case against her attackers. But the most significant revelation came when Maya explained why she had refused Dakota's advances that night at the mixer. It wasn't just personal preference or social awkwardness. Maya had recognized Dakota from her high school in Northern California, where he had been expelled during his senior year for sexually assaulting multiple female students. His father's money and influence had kept the incidents out of legal proceedings, but Maya remembered the whispered conversations and the girls who had transferred schools to escape ongoing harassment. "He's done this before," Maya said, her voice hardening with determination despite her physical pain. "At his previous school, at summer camps, probably here before I arrived. This isn't about power or competition or college athletics. This is about a predator who's learned that he can hurt people without consequences." The revelation that Dakota Williams had a documented history of sexual violence that predated his time at Ridgemont University changed everything. This wasn't just a case of college athletes behaving badly or hazing that had gotten out of control. It was evidence of systematic predatory behavior that had been enabled and covered up by multiple institutions over several years. Aria spent the next 36 hours conducting the most intensive intelligence-gathering operation of her life. Using skills and resources that went far beyond anything available to typical college students, she began building a comprehensive profile of Dakota Williams and his enablers. Her investigation revealed a pattern that stretched back to middle school and involved at least 17 documented victims across 4 different states. The Warriors Challenge tournament was now less than 24 hours away, and Dakota Williams was planning to use it as his ultimate demonstration of dominance. He had been telling anyone who would listen that he would be selecting a special victim for this year's exhibition, someone whose humiliation would serve as a permanent reminder of what happened to anyone who challenged his authority. Aria made her decision on Thursday evening, as she sat beside Maya's hospital bed and watched monitors track the vital signs of yet another young woman whose life had been shattered by systematic abuse that everyone knew about, but no one had been willing to stop. The time for quiet resistance and careful documentation had ended. Some battles could only be won through direct confrontation, and some predators only understood force. She signed up for the Warriors Challenge tournament at 11:47 p.m. on Thursday night, submitting her registration through the university's athletic department website with the simple explanation that she wanted to test her skills against experienced athletes. The registration system flagged her submission as unusual due to her size and gender, but tournament rules required that all properly completed applications be accepted regardless of the registrant's apparent qualifications. By Friday morning, word of her registration had spread throughout the wrestling team and their supporters. Dakota Williams was delighted by what he saw as the perfect opportunity to make an example of someone who clearly didn't understand her place in the campus hierarchy. He began planning an exhibition that would be remembered long after Maya Patel's assault had been forgotten and covered up. What Dakota didn't know was that Aria Blackstone had spent 8 years learning to hunt predators in environments where they believed themselves untouchable. She understood that sometimes justice required abandoning legal channels and institutional processes that were designed to protect perpetrators rather than victims. And she had finally encountered a situation where the only moral choice was to demonstrate that some people's reign of terror could be ended permanently and publicly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the true nature of power, violence, and justice in ways that no one in that gymnasium could anticipate. The 24 hours between Maya's assault and the tournament became a period of intense psychological warfare, as both sides prepared for what everyone sensed would be more than just another campus spectacle. Dakota Williams had transformed from his usual state of casual cruelty into something approaching obsessive focus, spending his time orchestrating what he envisioned as the most comprehensive public humiliation in Ridgemont University's history. His plan extended far beyond the physical confrontation itself. Dakota had mobilized his entire network of supporters, allies, and intimidated followers to ensure maximum attendance at the tournament. Fraternity presidents were offering extra social credits to members who showed up to witness what Dakota was promising would be the most educational beatdown these campus feminists will ever see. Sorority leaders were being pressured to bring their pledges to learn about appropriate respect for masculine authority. Dakota's girlfriend, Brittany Sullivan, had become his primary propaganda minister, flooding social media with promotional content that framed the upcoming confrontation as entertainment rather than violence. Her Instagram stories featured countdown timers, betting pools, and carefully edited highlights from previous tournaments where victims had been humiliated into submission. She organized viewing parties in dormitories and created hashtags that turned Aria's inevitable defeat into a trending topic before it had even occurred. The wrestling team's preparation involved more than just physical conditioning. They spent hours reviewing video footage from previous confrontations, analyzing their most effective intimidation techniques, and discussing how to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Dakota insisted that every detail be planned in advance, from the specific taunts they would use to the precise timing of their escalating violence. Marcus Reynolds, Dakota's closest teammate and enforcer, had researched Aria's background as thoroughly as possible using publicly available information. He reported back that she had no documented athletic experience, no martial arts training visible on any social media platforms, and no apparent support network that might complicate their plans for retaliation. From their perspective, she was the perfect victim. Isolated, inexperienced, and naive enough to walk directly into their trap. But while Dakota was planning his public spectacle, a very different kind of preparation was occurring in the shadows of campus life. The network of students who had been quietly organizing around Aria's leadership was mobilizing with the precision of a coordinated resistance movement. Dr. Patricia Reynolds had used her academic connections to ensure that independent media representatives would be present at the tournament, disguised as student journalists but equipped with professional-grade recording equipment. Kelly Brooks had spent the day coordinating with Maya's family, who had arrived from California armed with legal documentation about Dakota's previous assaults and a team of attorneys prepared to file criminal charges regardless of the university's preferences. Maya's father, a software engineer with extensive experience in digital security, had provided technical support for ensuring that any video evidence from the tournament would be simultaneously uploaded to multiple secure servers that couldn't be controlled or deleted by university administrators. The most significant development occurred when Sarah Martinez, the psychology student who had been targeted by the wrestlers 2 years earlier, emerged from her self-imposed isolation to provide Aria with detailed intelligence about the team's tactics, weaknesses, and psychological profiles. Sarah had spent months studying her tormentors with the same analytical rigor she applied to her academic research, documenting their behavioral patterns, trigger responses, and individual vulnerabilities. Dakota's entire identity depends on maintaining the illusion that he's unbeatable, Sarah explained during a clandestine meeting in the university's botanical gardens. He's never faced anyone who didn't immediately show fear or submission. His whole psychological framework depends on predictable responses from his victims. If you don't react the way he expects, if you don't give him the terror he feeds on, it destabilizes his entire sense of self. Sarah's analysis revealed that each member of the wrestling team had developed specific roles in their systematic abuse campaigns. Marcus Reynolds handled physical intimidation and violence. Trevor Nash specialized in social isolation and reputation destruction. Jordan Cole focused on sexual harassment and assault. Each had refined their particular expertise over years of unpunished practice, creating a coordinated system that had proven devastatingly effective against previous victims. But Sarah had also identified critical weaknesses in their approach. Their success had made them overconfident and predictable. They relied heavily on psychological intimidation rather than actual fighting skills, assuming that their size and reputation would be sufficient to overwhelm any opposition. Most importantly, they had never encountered organized resistance from someone who understood their methods and had developed countermeasures. The evening before the tournament, Aria received an unexpected visitor in her dormitory. Professor Mitchell Henderson knocked on her door at nearly midnight, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing an expression that mixed concern with barely controlled anger. Jessica was away for the weekend, leaving Aria alone to receive what turned out to be the most significant intelligence briefing of her preparation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know what you're planning," Professor Henderson said without preamble as he entered her room. "And I know enough about your background to understand that you're not the helpless transfer student you pretend to be." He placed the folder on her desk and opened it to reveal photographs, police reports, and medical records spanning nearly a decade. The documents detailed a pattern of violence and abuse that went far beyond anything Aria had suspected. Dakota Williams and several of his current teammates had been systematically transferred between schools and athletic programs, always staying one step ahead of criminal investigations and civil lawsuits. Their families' wealth and influence had created a network of protection that allowed them to continue their predatory behavior without facing meaningful consequences. "I've been collecting this evidence for 3 years," Professor Henderson explained, "waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to ensure they face justice. Tomorrow's tournament isn't just about you defending yourself. It's about breaking a cycle of abuse that has destroyed dozens of lives and corrupted multiple institutions." The professor's folder contained detailed psychological profiles prepared by experts who had studied similar patterns of systematic abuse. Dakota Williams was diagnosed as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic and sadistic features. His behavior pattern suggested someone whose violence would continue escalating until he was stopped by force or incarceration. Traditional interventions like counseling, mediation, or administrative discipline were not only ineffective but actually reinforced his sense of invulnerability. Most critically, Professor Henderson revealed that university administrators were already planning their cover-up strategy for whatever happened at the tournament. They had prepared statements attributing any violence to competitive athletic enthusiasm, and had arranged for friendly media coverage that would frame the event as harmless college entertainment rather than systematic abuse. "They're expecting you to be another victim they can quietly pay off in silence," Professor Henderson said. "They've done it before with other students who tried to stand up to the wrestling team. The system is designed to protect perpetrators and isolate victims. But tomorrow, that system is going to face something it's never encountered before." As Professor Henderson prepared to leave, he handed Aria a small device that looked like a standard fitness tracker but contained sophisticated recording equipment and emergency communication capabilities. "Whatever happens tomorrow, make sure it's documented," he said. "The only way to break this cycle permanently is to ensure that the truth can't be hidden or denied." After he left, Aria spent the remaining hours before dawn in meditation and final preparation. She reviewed everything she had learned about her opponents, their supporters, and the institutional systems that protected them. She understood that tomorrow's confrontation would determine not just her own safety, but the future of every student who had been terrorized by the wrestling team's reign of abuse. The transformation from observer to active participant was complete. Aria had spent 3 weeks carefully studying the enemy, building alliances with their victims, and preparing for a battle that would require every skill she had developed during 8 years of training in the world's most dangerous environments. Tomorrow, Dakota Williams and his team would discover that their latest victim was actually something they had never faced. A professional who specialized in hunting predators and dismantling systems of oppression. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the true nature of power and justice in ways that no one in that gymnasium could anticipate. The only question remaining was whether the institution that had protected these predators for so long would survive the revelation of who and what they had been sheltering. The morning of the Warriors Challenge tournament arrived with an electric anticipation that had transformed the entire campus into a buzzing hive of excitement and speculation. Dakota Williams woke before dawn, not from nerves or anxiety, but from the pure adrenaline rush of knowing that this day would cement his legacy as the most dominant figure in Ridgemont University's history. He had spent months planning what he considered the perfect demonstration of power, and today every detail would fall into place exactly as he had orchestrated. His first act was to call a team meeting in the Titan Athletic Complex at 6 a.m., 3 hours before the facility would officially open to the public. The 5 core members of his inner circle gathered in the main gymnasium where the tournament would take place, their voices echoing in the empty space as Dakota outlined his final strategy with the precision of a military commander planning a decisive battle. "Today isn't just about winning another fight," Dakota announced, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of someone who had never faced genuine opposition. "Today is about sending a message that will last for years. Every future student who thinks about challenging us will remember what happens to little girls who don't know their place." He had choreographed every aspect of the confrontation down to the minute. The first phase would involve psychological intimidation designed to break Aria's confidence before any physical contact occurred. Marcus Reynolds would handle crowd manipulation, ensuring that the audience's energy reached a fever pitch that would overwhelm any attempt at rational thought or intervention. Trevor Nash would coordinate social media coverage, live streaming the event to maximize humiliation and ensure permanent documentation of their dominance. Jordan Cole had been assigned the crucial role of escalation management. His job was to push Aria's emotional state beyond her breaking point through increasingly personal and sexual taunts, forcing her into either complete submission or desperate, ineffective resistance that would justify whatever level of violence Dakota deemed appropriate. They had refined this technique through years of practice, learning exactly how to provoke their victims into reactions that could be portrayed as aggressive or threatening. Dakota's masterpiece was the finale he had planned. After demonstrating Aria's complete helplessness through a series of humiliating physical maneuvers, he intended to offer her a choice: publicly apologize for her presumption and beg for mercy in front of the entire crowd, or face escalating consequences that would extend far beyond the tournament itself. He had prepared a series of demands that would force her to renounce any claim to equality or respect while acknowledging the natural superiority of male athletes. The wrestling team spent the early morning hours transforming the gymnasium into their personal coliseum. They moved equipment to create optimal sightlines for filming, adjusted lighting to ensure dramatic shadows and clear visibility, and configured the sound system to amplify their voices while making it difficult for any opposition to be heard. Every detail was calculated to maximize their psychological advantage while minimizing any possibility of outside interference. Brittany Sullivan arrived at 7 a.m. with her social media team, a carefully selected group of influencers and content creators who specialized in viral entertainment content. They had prepared hashtags, promotional graphics, and countdown timers that would transform Aria's humiliation into a trending topic across multiple platforms. Brittany's strategy involved framing the tournament as a form of educational comedy, teaching viewers about the importance of realistic expectations and appropriate boundaries for different types of people. The audience began arriving 2 hours before the official start time, drawn by social media promotion that had promised unprecedented entertainment and life-changing lessons about respect and hierarchy. Students filled the bleachers with an energy that mixed genuine excitement with uncomfortable anticipation. Many seemed to understand that they were about to witness something that went beyond normal athletic competition, but the crowd psychology and peer pressure made individual moral objections impossible to express. Local media representatives took their positions, most of them unaware that they were documenting what Dakota intended to be a systematic destruction of human dignity rather than a sporting event. The university's official photographers prepared their equipment while campus security personnel positioned themselves strategically around the gymnasium, their instructions emphasizing crowd control and liability management rather than participant safety. Dr. Patricia Reynolds and Professor Mitchell Henderson arrived separately, taking positions in different sections of the crowd to ensure comprehensive documentation of whatever was about to occur. They had coordinated with several trusted colleagues to create multiple independent records that couldn't be confiscated or suppressed by university administrators. Their hidden recording devices were disguised as standard academic equipment, ensuring that no detail of the upcoming confrontation would be lost. Dean Robert Fitzgerald made a conspicuous appearance, glad-handing with influential alumni and donors who had come to witness what they believed would be a demonstration of traditional masculine values triumphing over modern feminist presumption. His presence served multiple purposes. It provided official legitimacy to the event while ensuring that any negative consequences would be managed through appropriate administrative channels. The wrestling team's supporters had organized themselves into cheering sections that would provide coordinated psychological pressure designed to overwhelm any sympathy for Aria while amplifying the intimidating atmosphere. Fraternity members had prepared chants and slogans specifically designed to demean and objectify women, while sorority participants had been coached to demonstrate appropriate feminine appreciation for male dominance and authority. At 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, Dakota Williams emerged from the locker room wearing his signature wrestling uniform adorned with patches and symbols representing his years of unopposed dominance. His teammates flanked him in formation, their synchronized movement and identical expressions creating an image of coordinated menace that had intimidated countless previous victims into submission before any physical confrontation began. The crowd's energy reached a crescendo as Dakota took center stage, raising his arms to acknowledge the thunderous applause and cheering that greeted his appearance. He had spent years cultivating this level of adoration and fear, building a reputation that made actual violence almost unnecessary because his mere presence was sufficient to break most opponents' will to resist. His opening speech was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as sporting rhetoric. He spoke about the importance of understanding one's limitations, respecting natural hierarchies, and accepting reality rather than living in dangerous fantasies. Every word was carefully chosen to frame the upcoming confrontation as educational rather than abusive, positioning himself as a teacher providing necessary lessons about strength, weakness, and the natural order of human relationships. "We're here today to celebrate athletic excellence and competitive spirit," Dakota announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed gymnasium. "But we're also here to demonstrate important truths about courage, preparation, and the consequences of challenging forces beyond your understanding. Today's exhibition will provide valuable lessons for everyone present about the importance of knowing your place and respecting your betters." The audience responded with enthusiastic approval, their cheers and applause creating a wall of sound that would make any calls for mercy or intervention impossible to hear. Dakota had created the perfect environment for his planned demonstration. Maximum visibility, minimal accountability, and an audience that had been primed to view systematic humiliation as legitimate entertainment. As the official start time approached, Dakota and his team positioned themselves around the wrestling mat with the confidence of apex predators who had never encountered genuine opposition. They had orchestrated every detail of this confrontation to ensure their complete dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intentions. From their perspective, the next hour would cement their reputation as untouchable forces of nature who could destroy anyone foolish enough to challenge their authority. What they didn't know was that their carefully planned demonstration was about to become something entirely different. A public exposure of their true nature that would destroy the carefully constructed mythology surrounding their dominance. They had unknowingly created the perfect conditions for their own downfall, gathering the largest possible audience to witness their transformation from predators into prey. The trap had been set with meticulous precision, but not by Dakota Williams and his enablers. They were about to discover that their latest victim was actually something far more dangerous than they had ever encountered. A professional who had spent 8 years learning to hunt exactly their kind of predator in environments where failure meant death rather than social embarrassment. At exactly 10 a.m., the gymnasium doors opened one final time, and Aria Blackstone entered the arena that Dakota Williams had so carefully prepared for her destruction. The transformation in her appearance was so subtle that most observers didn't immediately notice it, but those who had been watching closely saw that the nervous, apologetic transfer student had been replaced by someone entirely different. Gone was the hesitant posture and downcast gaze that had characterized her previous 3 weeks on campus. Aria moved through the crowd with fluid precision, her steps measured and deliberate, her eyes scanning the environment with the systematic attention of someone conducting a final tactical assessment. She wore simple black athletic clothing that allowed complete freedom of movement, and her auburn hair was secured in a practical braid that wouldn't obstruct her vision during combat. The crowd's initial reaction was a mixture of confused murmurs and renewed laughter. Dakota's supporters had expected their victim to arrive in a state of visible terror or desperate bravado, but Aria's calm composure didn't fit their anticipated narrative. Several spectators commented that she seemed almost relaxed, as if she were attending a casual campus event rather than walking into what everyone assumed would be her systematic humiliation. Dakota Williams felt the first flicker of unease as he watched Aria approach the wrestling mat. Something about her movement pattern triggered subconscious alarm signals that his conscious mind couldn't immediately identify. She wasn't displaying any of the fear responses he had learned to recognize and exploit. Her breathing was controlled, her muscle tension was purposeful rather than anxious, and her awareness of her surroundings suggested someone who had been in similar situations many times before. But his moment of uncertainty was quickly overwhelmed by the crowd's energy and his own overconfidence. Dakota had been planning this confrontation for days, visualizing every aspect of his victim's inevitable surrender. He convinced himself that Aria's apparent calm was simply shock or denial, natural responses that would crumble the moment she faced the reality of his superior physical capabilities. The referee, a nervous graduate student named Timothy Walsh, approached Aria with the liability waivers and medical release forms that the university required for all tournament participants. His hands were shaking slightly as he explained the documents, clearly uncomfortable with his role in what everyone understood was about to become something far more violent than legitimate athletic competition. "Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this?" Walsh asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "Once the match begins, I won't be able to intervene until one participant submits or becomes incapacitated. These competitors are significantly larger and more experienced than you." Aria's response was delivered with the same steady calm that had characterized her behavior since entering the gymnasium. "I understand the risks," she said simply, "and I'm prepared for whatever happens next." As she spoke, she signed the waivers with a steady hand, her signature precise and unhurried despite the chaos surrounding her. Dakota seized this moment to begin his psychological assault, stepping forward with theatrical confidence, while his teammates moved into flanking positions around the mat. His opening taunts followed the script he had perfected through years of practice, designed to trigger emotional responses that would cloud his victim's judgment and make her vulnerable to his subsequent attacks. Well, Dakota announced loudly enough for the entire gymnasium to hear. "The brave little princess has actually shown up. I have to admire your commitment to embarrassing yourself in front of all these people. Tell me, sweetheart, did you practice your crying and begging routine? Or are you planning to improvise when reality hits?" The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, their response encouraging Dakota to escalate his verbal assault. Marcus Reynolds and Trevor Nash joined in with increasingly crude and personal attacks, their coordinated harassment designed to overwhelm Aria's emotional defenses while demonstrating their unity and dominance to the watching audience. But something unprecedented happened as their taunts continued. Instead of showing any signs of distress, humiliation, or anger, Aria simply stood in the center of the mat and listened with what appeared to be analytical interest. Her posture remained relaxed, her breathing stayed controlled, and her expression suggested someone studying her opponents rather than someone being victimized by them. Dakota's psychological assault reached its crescendo with a series of explicit sexual threats that had reduced previous victims to tears or desperate flight. But Aria's only response was a slight smile that somehow made Dakota feel as if he were the one being evaluated and found wanting. For the first time in his athletic career, his intimidation tactics were producing no visible effect on their intended target. The moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms occurred when Dakota, frustrated by Aria's lack of response, decided to escalate to physical intimidation. He stepped within arm's reach and raised his hand as if to strike her, a gesture that had never failed to produce immediate submission from previous victims. In the space of 1.8 seconds, everything changed. Aria moved with a speed and precision that defied every assumption the audience had made about her capabilities. Her response wasn't the desperate flailing of an untrained victim, but the controlled violence of someone who had spent years perfecting techniques designed to neutralize larger, stronger opponents. Dakota's raised hand was intercepted, trapped, and twisted in a joint lock that forced him to his knees while sending shockwaves of pain through his entire arm. The gymnasium fell into absolute silence as Dakota Williams, the undefeated champion who had terrorized the campus for 4 years, found himself kneeling helplessly while a woman half his size controlled his movement with surgical precision. The visual was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everyone's assumptions, that many spectators needed several seconds to process what they were witnessing. Dakota's shocked expression was clearly visible to the entire crowd as he realized that he was completely unable to break free from Aria's grip. Every attempt to use his superior size and strength only resulted in increased pain and more secure control by someone who clearly understood leverage, anatomy, and combat techniques that went far beyond anything taught in college wrestling programs. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, watching from the third row of bleachers, recognized the restraint technique immediately. It was a specialized military combat hold designed for controlling hostile prisoners without causing permanent injury unless the subject continued to resist. She had seen similar techniques demonstrated in documentaries about special forces training, but she had never witnessed them applied with such precision by someone who appeared to be a civilian college student. Marcus Reynolds, Dakota's closest teammate and enforcer, attempted to intervene by rushing toward the mat, but Aria's response demonstrated that she had been tracking his movement from the moment he began to move. Without releasing her control over Dakota, she delivered a precise kick that connected with Marcus's solar plexus, dropping him to the gymnasium floor while maintaining perfect balance and continuing to control his team captain. The crowd's stunned silence was broken by a voice that many had never heard before, Aria speaking with the clear, authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Everyone step back," she commanded, her voice carrying easily through the gymnasium without any apparent strain or excitement. "This demonstration will continue until Mr. Williams and his team understand some important lessons about consent, respect, and the consequences of predatory behavior." Trevor Nash and Jordan Cole, the remaining members of Dakota's inner circle, found themselves frozen in place by something they had never experienced: genuine uncertainty about their ability to control the situation through intimidation and violence. The small, quiet transfer student they had dismissed as harmless had just demonstrated capabilities that suggested professional training in combat techniques that went far beyond college athletics. Dakota's attempt to speak was cut short as Aria adjusted her grip slightly, causing enough additional discomfort to ensure his complete attention. When she spoke again, her words were directed not just at her immediate captive, but at the entire audience that had come to witness what they assumed would be her humiliation. "My name is Aria Blackstone," she announced clearly. "For the past 8 years, I've worked in conflict zones around the world, specializing in the neutralization of individuals who use violence and intimidation to prey on vulnerable populations. I've encountered men like Mr. Williams in war zones, failed states, and criminal organizations. They all share the same fundamental weakness. They've never faced someone who fights back with superior training and complete commitment to justice." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gymnasium as spectators began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a college athletic competition. The quiet, apologetic transfer student they had dismissed as an easy victim was revealing herself to be someone whose background and capabilities made Dakota Williams and his entire team look like amateur bullies playing at violence they didn't truly understand. As the implications of her identity began to sink in, the balance of power in the Titan athletic complex shifted completely. The predators had become prey, and their carefully orchestrated demonstration of dominance was about to become an education in justice that none of them would ever forget. The revelation of Aria's true identity acted like a catalyst that transformed the entire atmosphere in the gymnasium from anticipatory entertainment into something approaching a public tribunal. The psychological shock of seeing Dakota Williams, the campus's most feared figure, rendered completely helpless by someone they had all dismissed as harmless, created a cognitive dissonance that rippled through the crowd in visible waves. For several long seconds, the only sounds in the massive space were Dakota's labored breathing and the subtle mechanical hum of the recording equipment that was capturing every moment of his humiliation. Then, like a dam bursting under accumulated pressure, the floodgates of suppressed testimony began to open as students who had suffered under the wrestling team's reign of terror found their voices for the first time in years. Sarah Martinez was the first to stand up from her seat in the middle bleachers, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed gymnasium as she addressed not Aria, but the hundreds of spectators who had come expecting entertainment and were instead witnessing justice. "I want everyone here to know what Dakota Williams did to me 2 years ago," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "He and his teammates sexually assaulted me at a campus party, then spent months destroying my reputation when I tried to report it. They made me afraid to leave my dorm room, afraid to attend classes, afraid to exist in the same space as them." Her testimony broke the spell of silence that had held the audience captive since Aria's demonstration began. Other voices began joining hers, creating a chorus of survivors who had been waiting years for an opportunity to speak their truth in front of witnesses who couldn't dismiss or ignore their experiences. Kelly Brooks stood next, pointing directly at Marcus Reynolds, who was still struggling to recover from Aria's precisely delivered kick. "Marcus Reynolds broke into my dorm room last semester and threatened to rape me because I wouldn't write his English literature papers for him," she declared. "He told me that nobody would believe me because I was just another lying feminist trying to destroy good men's lives." The crowd's mood was shifting with each new testimony, as spectators began to understand that they had been complicit in protecting systematic predators rather than supporting legitimate athletes. Many students were pulling out their phones, not to record entertainment, but to document confessions and testimonies that would serve as evidence in criminal proceedings that could no longer be avoided or suppressed. Dr. Patricia Reynolds descended from the bleachers carrying the folder of evidence she had been compiling for 3 years, her academic composure replaced by the righteous anger of someone who had watched institutional corruption protect predators while abandoning their victims. I have documented evidence of 17 separate assault cases involving members of this wrestling team, she announced, holding up photographs and police reports that the university administration had worked to suppress. I have medical records, witness testimonies, and recordings of university officials actively covering up crimes to protect the athletic program's reputation. Dean Robert Fitzgerald, who had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm, attempted to regain control of the situation by invoking his administrative authority. "This is highly inappropriate," he declared, moving toward the center of the gymnasium with the expectation that his position would restore order. "This is a university sporting event, not a courtroom. These allegations should be handled through proper channels." Aria's response was delivered without releasing her control over Dakota, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had dealt with corrupt officials in far more dangerous circumstances than college administration. "Dean Fitzgerald," she said clearly, "you are personally responsible for covering up at least 12 documented cases of sexual assault and physical violence committed by members of this wrestling team. You have threatened victims, suppressed evidence, and used your position to protect predators at the expense of student safety." Professor Mitchell Henderson emerged from the crowd, carrying additional documentation that he had been secretly gathering for months. "I have recorded conversations with Dean Fitzgerald where he explicitly states that protecting the wrestling team's reputation is more important than student safety," he announced. "I have financial records showing that the athletic department has made undisclosed payments to assault victims in exchange for their silence." The systematic exposure of institutional corruption continued as more faculty members, staff, and students came forward with evidence that had been carefully documented but never presented in a forum where it couldn't be suppressed or ignored. The wrestling team's reign of terror was being revealed as part of a larger system of institutional failure that had prioritized reputation management over basic human decency. Maya Patel's parents, who had been quietly documenting their daughter's assault case, stood up from their seats near the front of the gymnasium. Her father, a software engineer whose technical expertise had proven crucial in preserving digital evidence, addressed the crowd with the calm precision of someone presenting irrefutable data. "My daughter is currently in intensive care because these men nearly killed her 3 days ago," he stated, holding up photographs of Maya's injuries that made several spectators gasp in horror. "We have security footage, medical records, and expert testimony that prove this was attempted murder, not a campus altercation. The university has spent the last 3 days trying to convince us that pursuing criminal charges would be harmful to our daughter's future." The revelation that Maya's assault had been far more severe than anyone had realized sent shockwaves through the audience. Students who had heard rumors about the incident now understood that they had been witnessing escalating violence that could have resulted in murder if left unchecked. Brittany Sullivan, Dakota's girlfriend and social media coordinator, found herself facing a crowd that had turned hostile as the true nature of her boyfriend's behavior became undeniably clear. Her attempts to defend the wrestling team's actions were met with jeers and demands for accountability from students who were beginning to understand their own complicity in enabling systematic abuse. The local media representatives who had come expecting to cover a routine campus event found themselves documenting what would become a national news story about institutional corruption, systematic sexual violence, and the failure of higher education administration to protect students from predatory behavior. Their cameras captured not just the physical confrontation between Aria and Dakota, but the broader social reckoning that was occurring as an entire community confronted years of willful blindness to obvious criminal behavior. Campus security officers, who had been positioned to manage crowd control during what was expected to be routine entertainment, were faced with a situation that clearly required criminal investigation rather than administrative discipline. Several officers were already on their phones with local police, reporting multiple felony assault allegations and requesting backup to secure evidence before it could be destroyed or suppressed. The wrestling team members who remained standing were backing away from the center of the gymnasium as they realized that their era of impunity was ending in the most public way possible. Jordan Cole and Trevor Nash were edging toward the exits, but found their paths blocked by students and faculty who were determined to ensure that all perpetrators faced accountability for their actions. Dakota Williams, still controlled by Aria's precise grip, was forced to listen as victim after victim recounted the specific ways he and his team had destroyed their lives. The psychological impact of hearing his crimes detailed in front of hundreds of witnesses was clearly visible on his face as he began to understand that his carefully constructed mythology of dominance was being permanently shattered. The cascade of revelations continued as more evidence emerged from sources throughout the university community. Student government representatives admitted they had been pressured to ignore complaints about the wrestling team. Resident advisors revealed they had been instructed not to report incidents involving team members. Even campus medical staff came forward with testimonies about treating suspicious injuries while being discouraged from filing mandatory reports. The systematic exposure of corruption was comprehensive and devastating, revealing an institutional culture that had prioritized protecting predators over serving students. The wrestling team's individual crimes were being revealed as symptoms of a broader failure that had infected every level of university administration and governance. As the testimony continued, it became clear that this moment represented more than just the downfall of particular individuals. It was the collapse of an entire system that had enabled systematic abuse while punishing those who tried to expose or resist it. The carefully maintained silence that had protected predators for years was being broken permanently, and with it, the culture of fear that had dominated campus life for far too long. The systematic dismantling of the wrestling team's reign of terror began immediately, even as Dakota Williams remained immobilized on the gymnasium floor, and the testimonies continued to pour forth from survivors throughout the crowd. Within 30 minutes of Aria's revelation, the first wave of law enforcement officers arrived at the Titan Athletic Complex, summoned by multiple 911 calls from faculty members, students, and even some parents who were live-streaming the unprecedented confrontation. Detective Lieutenant Amanda Foster of the Ridgemont County Sheriff's Department had been investigating rumors about the wrestling team for over a year, but had been repeatedly stonewalled by university administrators who claimed jurisdiction over student conduct issues. Now, faced with multiple felony assault allegations being presented in front of hundreds of witnesses, she finally had the legal authority to bypass university interference and launch a comprehensive criminal investigation. This facility is now a crime scene, Detective Foster announced as she surveyed the gymnasium, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with institutional cover-ups before. Everyone present is a potential witness, and this entire confrontation is now evidence in multiple criminal cases. University security will coordinate with county deputies to ensure that all relevant documentation is preserved. The immediate priority was securing evidence before it could be destroyed or tampered with by university officials who had spent years protecting the wrestling team from accountability. Detective Foster's team began systematically collecting the documentation that survivors and faculty members had brought forward, while digital forensic specialists worked to preserve all video footage and social media content that had captured the day's events. Dr. Patricia Reynolds found herself appointed as the unofficial coordinator between law enforcement and the academic community. Her 3 years of careful documentation suddenly transformed from academic research into criminal evidence. Her files contained not just individual incident reports, but detailed analyses of patterns, timelines, and institutional responses that would prove crucial in establishing the scope and duration of the systematic abuse. What we're dealing with isn't just isolated criminal behavior, Dr. Reynolds explained to Detective Foster as they reviewed the accumulated evidence. This is organized criminal activity that has been protected by institutional corruption. The university administration has been actively suppressing evidence, intimidating witnesses, and manipulating investigative processes to protect perpetrators. The revelation that university officials had been complicit in covering up serious crimes transformed the investigation from a campus disciplinary matter into a federal case involving institutional corruption and civil rights violations. FBI agents specializing in institutional abuse cases were already being contacted by Detective Foster's supervisors, who recognized that the scope of the investigation would require federal resources and authority. Meanwhile, Aria maintained her restraint hold on Dakota Williams with professional precision, ensuring his compliance while avoiding any actions that could be characterized as excessive force. Her handling of the situation demonstrated the kind of tactical expertise that comes from years of training in conflict de-escalation and prisoner control, skills that clearly went far beyond anything available through civilian self-defense courses. Mr. Williams is going to remain exactly where he is until law enforcement officers are ready to take him into custody, Aria announced, addressing the crowd but speaking directly to Dakota's remaining teammates who were considering intervention. Any attempt to interfere with this citizen's arrest will be met with appropriate defensive measures. The legal framework for Aria's actions was solid. Under state law, citizens were authorized to detain individuals who had committed felonies in their presence, and Dakota's assault on Maya Patel constituted felony aggravated assault. Aria's restraint techniques were textbook examples of minimum necessary force, designed to control rather than injure, exactly what law enforcement training manuals recommended for similar situations. University officials found themselves in an impossible position as their carefully constructed system of protection and cover-up collapsed in real time. President Lawrence Whitman, who had been attending a donor breakfast when the confrontation began, arrived at the gymnasium to find his institution's reputation being destroyed by revelations that he could no longer deny or suppress. "We are committed to full cooperation with law enforcement," President Whitman announced to the media representatives who were already broadcasting live coverage of the unfolding scandal. "The university will conduct a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures to ensure that such incidents never occur again." But his carefully worded statement was immediately contradicted by faculty members who had documented years of administrative interference with previous investigations. Professor Henderson stepped forward with recorded conversations that revealed President Whitman had personally approved strategies for protecting the wrestling team from criminal prosecution. "President Whitman has been briefed on every major incident involving the wrestling team for the past 4 years," Professor Henderson declared, holding up transcripts of administrative meetings where protecting the university's reputation was explicitly prioritized over student safety. These weren't isolated failures of oversight. This was deliberate policy designed to protect perpetrators at the expense of victims. The institutional reckoning accelerated as more university employees came forward with evidence of systematic corruption. Financial aid officers revealed that scholarship funds had been used to silence victims. Campus medical staff admitted they had been pressured not to report suspicious injuries. Even maintenance workers disclosed that they had been ordered to disable security cameras in areas where the wrestling team was known to assault students. The wrestling program itself was immediately suspended pending investigation, with all team members banned from campus facilities and athletic activities. Scholarship funding was frozen, and several wrestlers found themselves facing immediate academic suspension as their fraudulent transcripts and grade manipulation schemes were exposed alongside the violence allegations. Marcus Reynolds and Trevor Nash were taken into custody within an hour of the initial confrontation, charged with multiple felony counts including aggravated assault, sexual assault, and criminal conspiracy. Jordan Cole attempted to flee the campus but was apprehended at the bus station with a hastily packed bag containing evidence that linked him to numerous unreported incidents. The broader implications extended far beyond individual criminal charges. The investigation revealed that similar patterns of abuse and cover-up existed at multiple universities where wrestling team members had previously competed, creating a network of institutional corruption that spanned several states and numerous academic institutions. Civil rights organizations and victim advocacy groups mobilized immediately to provide support for survivors and ensure that the investigation remained transparent and thorough. Legal aid societies began preparing class action lawsuits against the university and individual administrators who had enabled the systematic abuse. Maya Patel's family announced their intention to pursue not just criminal charges but comprehensive civil litigation that would hold the university financially accountable for years of negligent supervision and deliberate indifference to student safety. Their legal team, now expanded to include federal civil rights attorneys, was preparing cases that could result in millions of dollars in damages and court-ordered institutional reforms. The transformation of campus culture began immediately as students realized that the atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had dominated their daily lives was finally ending. Support groups formed spontaneously as survivors connected with each other for the first time, sharing experiences and resources while beginning the long process of healing from trauma that had been ignored and minimized for years. Aria's role evolved from active participant to expert consultant as law enforcement agencies recognized that her background and expertise could provide crucial insights into the investigation. Her experience in conflict zones where institutional authority had collapsed made her uniquely qualified to help investigators understand how systematic abuse could be perpetuated and concealed within seemingly legitimate organizational structures. The academic implications were equally profound as researchers and policy experts recognized that Ridgemont University's case represented a perfect example of how institutional cultures could enable and protect predatory behavior while systematically silencing victims. The documentation and evidence being collected would provide crucial data for understanding and preventing similar situations at other institutions. As emergency medical personnel finally arrived to assess Dakota Williams for potential injuries from his prolonged restraint, Aria demonstrated the same professional precision in transferring custody that had characterized her entire intervention. She provided law enforcement officers with a detailed report on her actions, Dakota's responses, and any potential medical concerns that might affect his processing and detention. The systematic reconstruction of campus safety and institutional integrity was beginning, built on the foundation of truth, accountability, and justice that had been established through one person's willingness to stand up against seemingly insurmountable odds and expose corruption that had been protected for far too long. 6 months after the confrontation that would become known as the Ridgemont Reckoning, the transformation of both the university and the broader conversation about institutional accountability had exceeded even the most optimistic predictions of reform advocates. Aria Blackstone found herself at the center of a movement that had grown far beyond the borders of a single campus, as universities across the country grappled with their own histories of enabling systematic abuse while protecting perpetrators. The criminal trials had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through the collegiate athletic community. Dakota Williams received a 15-year sentence for multiple counts of aggravated assault, sexual assault, and conspiracy to commit violence, with additional federal charges pending for civil rights violations. Marcus Reynolds, Trevor Nash, and Jordan Cole each received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. Their careful documentation of their own crimes through social media posts and recorded conversations providing prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of their guilt. But the individual convictions represented only the beginning of the broader institutional transformation that Aria's intervention had catalyzed. The federal investigation into Ridgemont University had uncovered systematic corruption that extended far beyond the athletic department, resulting in the resignation of President Whitman, Dean Fitzgerald, and 14 other high-level administrators who had actively participated in covering up serious crimes. The university faced $47 million in civil settlements with survivors, along with court-mandated reforms that fundamentally restructured how institutions of higher education were required to handle reports of violence and harassment. The Ridgemont Protocols became the national standard for campus safety, requiring independent oversight, mandatory reporting, and transparent investigation processes that prevented administrative interference with criminal matters. Aria had been offered numerous lucrative positions by security consulting firms, media companies, and advocacy organizations seeking to capitalize on her expertise and public recognition. Instead, she had chosen to complete her degree at Ridgemont while working part-time with the newly established Campus Safety Institute, a research and training organization dedicated to preventing institutional abuse and supporting survivors. Her senior thesis, titled Institutional Predation, Recognizing and Dismantling Systems of Protected Abuse, became required reading in criminal justice, psychology, and education programs nationwide. The research combined her academic study of conflict resolution with her practical experience in both creating and destroying systems of organized violence, providing a comprehensive framework for understanding how institutions could be reformed or rebuilt. Maya Patel had not only recovered from her physical injuries, but had become one of the most effective advocates for survivor rights in the country. Her engineering background proved invaluable in developing technological solutions for evidence preservation, secure reporting systems, and digital platforms that connected survivors with resources and support networks. The Patel Foundation, established with proceeds from her family's legal settlements, funded similar safety initiatives at universities across 3 continents. What Aria taught us isn't just that we could fight back, Maya explained during her keynote address at the first annual Campus Safety Summit. She showed us that fighting back was our responsibility. That silence in the face of systematic abuse makes us complicit in the harm that follows. She gave us permission to be strong, but more importantly, she showed us that strength without action is meaningless. The ripple effects of the Ridgemont reckoning had extended far beyond higher education. Corporate environments, military institutions, and government agencies found themselves facing increased scrutiny and demands for accountability as the public recognized that the patterns of abuse and cover-up exposed at Ridgemont existed throughout society's power structures. Dr. Patricia Reynolds had been promoted to head the newly created Department of Institutional Ethics, with a mandate to study and prevent systematic abuse across all types of organizations. Her research had identified common patterns that allowed predators to operate with impunity. Hierarchical structures that discouraged reporting, institutional cultures that prioritized reputation over safety, and leadership that viewed victims as threats to be neutralized rather than people deserving protection. The academic community had embraced the Ridgemont case as a perfect example of how individual courage could catalyze systematic change when combined with careful documentation, strategic planning, and institutional pressure. Aria's intervention was studied not just as an example of effective self-defense, but as a masterclass in how to expose and dismantle corrupt systems while building sustainable alternatives. Professor Mitchell Henderson had co-authored a comprehensive study of institutional transformation that tracked the changes at Ridgemont over the 6 months following the confrontation. Student mental health indicators had improved dramatically, academic performance had increased across all demographic groups, and campus culture surveys showed unprecedented levels of safety, trust, and community engagement. The most significant change wasn't in policies or procedures, Professor Henderson noted in his research summary. It was in the fundamental understanding that institutions exist to serve people, not the other way around. Students stopped accepting that abuse was inevitable and started demanding that their safety and dignity be protected. The legal precedents established by the Ridgemont cases had empowered prosecutors and civil rights attorneys nationwide to pursue institutional corruption cases that previously would have been dismissed as too complex or politically sensitive. The Department of Justice had established a specialized unit for investigating systematic abuse in educational settings, with former FBI agents and civil rights attorneys working to identify and prosecute similar patterns of behavior at other institutions. Aria's personal transformation had been equally profound. The quiet, careful observer who had arrived at Ridgemont as a transfer student had evolved into a confident leader whose expertise was sought by lawmakers, researchers, and reformers working to prevent institutional abuse. But she had also found something she hadn't expected: a sense of peace that came from using her skills to build rather than destroy. For 8 years, I was trained to neutralize threats and eliminate dangers, Aria reflected during an interview with National Public Radio. But what I learned at Ridgemont was that the most important battles aren't fought against external enemies. They're fought against systems that protect predators while abandoning the people they're supposed to serve. Those battles require different weapons: truth, courage, and the willingness to stand up even when you're standing alone. The transformation of campus culture had created space for conversations and initiatives that would have been impossible under the previous regime of fear and intimidation. Student organizations focused on consent education, bystander intervention, and survivor support had flourished, creating a comprehensive network that made abuse both less likely and less likely to be ignored when it occurred. The economic impact of the reforms had been significant but ultimately beneficial. While Ridgemont University had paid tens of millions in settlements and reform costs, enrollment had increased by 23% as students and families recognized the institution's commitment to safety and accountability. The university's reputation had been rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and integrity rather than athletic success and donor appeasement. National media coverage had transformed Aria from an anonymous college student into a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. But she had used her platform carefully, consistently redirecting attention from her individual actions to the systematic changes necessary to prevent similar abuse. Her message was always the same: individual courage was important, but sustainable change required collective action and institutional commitment. The final chapter of Aria's undergraduate career came during her commencement speech, delivered to a graduating class that included dozens of survivors who had found their voices and their strength in the aftermath of the Ridgemont reckoning. Her message was simple but profound. True strength wasn't measured by the ability to dominate others, but by the willingness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. 6 months ago, this campus was controlled by fear. Aria told the assembled graduates, faculty, and families. Students lived in terror, faculty remained silent, and administrators protected predators while abandoning victims. Today, we leave here knowing that we have the power to demand better, the responsibility to speak truth, and the obligation to ensure that no one else suffers what we allowed to continue for far too long. As she concluded her remarks, Aria looked out at an audience that included Maya Patel, Dr. Patricia Reynolds, Professor Henderson, and dozens of other survivors and allies who had found the courage to transform a culture of systematic abuse into a community of mutual protection and support. The girl who had arrived at Ridgemont University seeking nothing more than the peace of anonymity had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that choose us, and that true peace can only be built on a foundation of justice, accountability, and the unwavering commitment to ensure that strength is used to protect rather than prey upon the vulnerable. The legacy of the Ridgemont reckoning would continue long after graduation, as each survivor and ally carried forward the understanding that institutional abuse thrives in silence but crumbles in the face of coordinated resistance. They had learned that systems of oppression are only as strong as people's willingness to accept them, and that sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person's decision to stand up and refuse to be broken. In the end, the most important lesson of Aria Blackstone's intervention wasn't about fighting techniques or tactical expertise. It was about the transformative power that emerges when someone with the ability to resist refuses to accept that abuse is inevitable, and instead uses their strength to prove that justice, accountability, and human dignity are always worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.